introduce to you Peter Ricketts, Lord Ricketts. Peter and I worked together as civil servants. In fact, we published one or two things together in the Times newspaper. I think, didn't we have something together in Prospect?
I think we did, yep.
And Peter, sparing your blushes, I think perhaps there's no more distinguished former diplomat in the UK than Peter. He's done almost all the big jobs in the British foreign system. You were permanent secretary of the Foreign Office. You were the first national security advisor, making the National Security Council one of the really good innovations of the Cameron government work properly. And I suspect most favourite of all, certainly talking last night to Suzanne, most favourite of all, you're also ambassador to France. So we're going to have a conversation mostly about the state of the world and what to do about it. But I would just like, firstly, to ask you a different sort of question, which is, when you look back now at your early career and why you wanted to come into foreign service, what are the things that you remember with greatest fondness or that stick most in your mind?
Well, thank you very, very much indeed, Mark. First of all, before we get any further, can I say a big thank you to you and the organisation for inviting us for this lovely time in Bath, and also say, after that moment of silence, how much I respect what the UN staff have been doing, particularly in Gaza, where I think the UNRWA operation has been absolutely extraordinary. And I do think it is extraordinary that the British government are not yet funding UNRWA again. So it's wonderful to be among you. Thank you very much indeed. When we get to some questions, I hope people will put the most challenging possible questions to me. And just to encourage them, I have brought a copy of my book, which will go to the most interesting question I get, which won't be to you because that's unfair, but to somebody from the gathering. So thank you very much. Early career. Well, I think all diplomats love their first posting. Mine was Singapore in 1975, where I lived on my own and I had the only MG midget on the island. And so that was a wonderful start to diplomacy. But I've worked with some really interesting and great foreign secretaries. And the one I think I'm fondest of is Geoffrey Howe. Many of you may remember Geoffrey Howe. He had an extraordinary combination of really powerful intellect and wisdom, which don't always go together, steely determination, stamina, and enormous courtesy. And that combination was pretty remarkable. He was great to work for. We worked together through, for example, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the negotiations with China on Hong Kong that landed up in the Joint Declaration of 1984. So some big, big issues. And Suzanne will remember, he also worked incredibly hard half the night. He didn't seem to sleep at all. He did his box at home with Capital Radio on. And so often about after midnight, we would get a call and I would pick it up and he would say, "It's me." And then he'd say, "Have you heard the news?" And I'd say, "No, I'm asleep." But he never slept. A wonderful, wonderful man. And I wish we had more like him in politics today.
Very good. Thank you very much. So let's get into the sort of state of the world. I mean, you were ambassador to NATO, as I said earlier, and you've been involved in kind of offering commentary on what's going on the global security scene, and in particular the Ukraine war. I just wonder now, obviously the news today has got the fact that there won't be an election this year for obvious reasons in Ukraine, that Zelensky will be staying on, but can you give us your assessment of the military situation and the prospects for Ukraine surviving and what that means for the global peace and security?
How long have we got?
Well,
I think I would start, yes, the news from day to day is pretty bad for Ukraine, but if you look at the big picture, however this turns out, it's already been a strategic disaster for Putin. And it was Putin's decision to go in, I think not the Russian system, but he has failed to achieve his initial objective massively. He's failed to establish any kind of dominance over the air in Ukraine. His army has been shown up to be corrupt, poorly equipped, badly led. he tried to use the lever of energy dependence in Europe, and that broke in his hand. And one of the really major strategic shifts is that Europe is no longer dependent on Russian oil and gas. He's prompted NATO to get larger, with Finland and Sweden joining, stronger, I think more united than I can ever remember NATO. And he has ensured a generation of pro-Western nationalist Ukrainians, whatever language they speak, which I think is going to be a major fact long after he's left the scene. So yes, it's the biggest crisis in European security since 1945. First time we've had industrial warfare back on the continent in a way I don't think any of us could have imagined. NATO, I think, has responded well. It's done what it was required to do. Having spent 20 years on the expeditionary operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's back to territorial defense of its member states. Putin has not dared put a foot across the NATO line, showing that NATO deterrence works. And our challenge now is to gear up enough in terms of war production to keep Ukraine going, to avoid Putin getting to anything that can look like a victory for him. I've never myself felt that it's going to be outright victory for Ukraine. I don't see them pushing every last Russian out of Crimea, for example. But if we could get to a place where there's a sort of armistice somewhere around where things were when he launched the invasion 2 years ago, internationally supervised, giving the free Ukraine the opportunity to move towards the EU and NATO, I think that would not be a bad outcome. If you think of the armistice in Korea, North and South Korea were similar economic level in 1954. Well, look at them now. So I think it's not impossible to turn an armistice, what they call a frozen conflict, into something that is a real success for the 80% of Ukraine which is free, and I think that should be our aim.
And when we think about reader costs and consequences for other places, one of the things that was discussed in the immediate aftermath of the invasion in 2022 was whether part of the reason why it was important that Ukraine didn't lose was to act as a deterrent to Xi Jinping on his ambitions in China. What do you think about the wider consequences if it plays out in the way you've described?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's given Xi Jinping pause before invading Taiwan. I'm not sure he was ever really intending to use military force. But if Russia can't roll across a land border on a flat plain, and make a success of that invasion, what chance does he have of getting across the straits and assaulting a mountainous island which is extremely well defended? So I think it's made a military operation against Taiwan less likely. I think Xi Jinping will go about his aims by trying to grind down Taiwan using all the instruments he can, economic, subversive, trying to destabilize Taiwan, to threaten it without actually invading it. But I think another big geopolitical fact is that the Western sanctions on Russia have pushed Russia into the arms of China. China are happily buying cheap Russian oil, as are India. China is supplying, I think, not weapons, but technology, economic support to Russia. We see Putin in Beijing with their partnership, so-called limitless partnership. And I think the result is that Russia will increasingly become a kind of second fiddle to China in the Chinese sphere. And the way I see the world is we are really having a break apart into different zones of influence and power, a Chinese-dominated zone around the renminbi, Chinese power, a dollar-dominated Western bloc, perhaps a carve-out for the European Union with its rather different approach on values and privacy and so on, but a very divided, fractured world. And clearly Russia, China, with Iran, we've seen a lot about Iran in the last 24 hours, are now part of a bloc which sees the West as adversaries. And that's the shape of the world I think we're going to have to deal with.
Right, so one of the issues that interests all of us in this room against that background is how the last 2 years has reflected on the UN, if you like, and how the UN and the leaders in the UN need to navigate the period ahead, because we've just come out of what was really 20 years of high point for the UN, collaboration, responsibility to protect and so on.
Yeah.
The last 2 years have been quite different, in a way a bit more like the UN's first 25 or 30 years. But what's your commentary on how the leadership has acquitted itself and what it has to think about for the future?
I think, as the framers of the Charter knew very well, the British and the Americans, by accepting the principle of a veto for the permanent members, you meant that the Security Council was hobbled when the great powers were at loggerheads. I mean, I did a little bit of research on the origins of the UN for my book. Incidentally, the wonderful preamble, I gather, is essentially, it was written by Jan Smuts,
right,
the great statesman who saw the Charter draft right at the end in San Francisco and said, I think it's good, but it needs some vision. Right. And so he added this visionary passage, and what wonderful prose it is. How far away are we from that today? I think the Security Council has been losing power, really losing influence ever since Iraq, for example, where the US and UK chose to move against Security Council better judgment without proper authorization to the invasion of Iraq. I think that taught the Russians and Chinese a lesson. And from then on, it's been pretty much impossible to resolve any of the crises that involve the major powers in the Security Council. Libya, Syria, of course, Ukraine, and so on. So I think the Security Council is inevitably logjammed. The General Assembly, I think, continues to play its role as a crucial fulcrum pivot for public opinion globally, and the Secretary General in the General Assembly. We've had some very powerful moments there on Israel-Gaza, on Ukraine, where countries have really been challenged as to how they're going to vote. Disappointing outcomes on Ukraine, with a lot of non-aligned countries not siding with us in concluding that this is a fundamental challenge to the Charter. I say in my book, and I believe very strongly, that one of the crown jewels of the UN system are the agencies. And the agencies have continued to function despite the great power being at loggerheads. You know, the WHO is not without its faults, but I mean, that's largely because of the governance that states have imposed on it and the lack of funding. But we will never recreate another global public health body, and so pandemic preparedness needs a good WHO. Organizations like FAO, like UNICEF, like UNRWA, you know, are doing work that nobody else is doing. So I think the agency constellation is something that we really do need to preserve, and we need to continue to work through the General Assembly as well. Honestly, the Security Council will never reform it. It exists. It's far from ideal. But there's not much we can do about it. So I'm really, really saddened and shocked by the Israeli attack, outright attack on the integrity of the UN and the Secretary General. I think it's completely uncalled for, especially the mess that they are making with any sort of occupying power responsibilities in Gaza. And I think the witch hunting in UNRWA is very unfortunate. So we're going through a bad time, but I think the leadership of the UN have just got to keep going and make the most of the parts of the system which are still doing really good work and which are irreplaceable.
So I better just, because several people in the room know that one of my current jobs is as a member of the Global Preparedness and Monitoring Board, which is predicting the next pandemic for WHO. So
right.
I didn't ask Peter to say all those nice things about
but they're written in there, so they're even before I knew that, that's what I believe.
Now, you touched on Gaza. I want to ask you a question, but not the obvious questions on Gaza. Do you think it's Putin or Trump who is gaining most from what Netanyahu is doing?
I think it's Xi Jinping.
Right.
I think Xi Jinping, it's like Christmas. America is distracted. It's bogged down. As far as he can see, it's on the wrong side of this conflict. He can go to all the non-aligned capitals and say, there you go. You know, look at the Americans. When there's a just cause, when there's a country devastating, bombing, killing civilians next door, who are the Americans supporting? You know, they're supporting the aggressor. And so it's only China that is taking a principled stand on an issue like Gaza. And he's making hay in non-aligned capitals with that. So I think Xi Jinping is a big winner from the distraction of this. He's keeping away from the politics. Maybe he's trying to position himself to be a bit of an honest broker one day between the Sunni Arabs and the Iranians, for example. So he's, yeah, inevitably Putin is a winner for anything that draws attention away from the war in Ukraine. Trump, I don't know. I mean, who knows what position Trump would take anyway on Gaza. I understand he doesn't like Netanyahu because Netanyahu came out early for Biden after the election results in 2020. So I think it's the authoritarian leaders who are watching the West flounder, frankly, on Israel-Gaza and finding that quite comfortable.
Just a bit more on the US and the prospect of Trump too. What worries you about that as a quite high-risk prospect? I remember in 2016, I actually put £100 on Trump early in the year at enormous odds, and we took the family on holiday, and I'd rather have lost the money. But now, Trump is an odds-on favourite, and what do you think we should be worried about if on the 20th of January next year he's president again?
Well, I think my main worry is that Trump 2 would be a more effective Trump than Trump 1, because he'd come in having had 4 years in power and also having had years where his think tanks and gurus have been preparing the ground for Trump 2. So he would, the trouble is, from day one, he'd be more effective.
Right.
We partly survived Trump 1 because he was so useless that he couldn't actually see through his ideas into policy, didn't know how to pull the levers. Well, this time he will have people around him who do. I think there'll be an attack on the public service in America. Thousands of people chased out of jobs for having done the job that they should have done. I think his economic policy, I fear he'll say what he'll do what he's been saying.
Yeah.
He's talking about 200% tariffs on China, 100% tariffs on everybody else importing to the US. He may well do it. So I think further blows to the open trading system, to the international rules-based order as we know it, more chaos, more uncertainty, more undermining of NATO, and possibly some sort of effort to do a strongman deal with Putin over the heads of the Ukrainians.
Right.
So very dangerous.
Another big election coming up imminently, European Parliament elections. You have family interests, both your children and their families live in Brussels.
Yep.
What should we be looking for, and how should we interpret the potential outcomes of the European parliamentary elections next month?
I think the headlines will all be about the far right making gains. I think they're almost certain to make gains pretty widely across the continent. Certainly you can see it in France, where Marine Le Pen's party is leading the polls for the French. The far right in Germany are going through a bit of a more difficult time. But you see what's happened in the Netherlands. We're about to have a far right government in the Netherlands, by the look of it. Not actually with Mr. Wilders in power, but being the kingmaker. And I think the EP, there will be a bigger block of the far right and further right. I don't think it'll be big enough to unseat Ursula von der Leyen, because the centre-right have still got such a large bloc that I think they will still just about have a majority. She may have to do a bit of negotiating to bring on board some Greens and Social Democrats and so on. So I don't think it'll affect the leadership of the Commission, and I think it's very likely we'll have von der Leyen back again. But there will be a noisy, larger block of far-right people making probably more effective noise than Nigel Farage did when he was there. So it'll change the tonality, but I'm not sure it'll change the direction of European policy. What will change the direction of European policy is the prospect of enlargement.
Right.
To bring in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Western Balkans, which are a long-term project, but they can't even begin to do that really without thinking about reform of the EU itself. So there's a big agenda coming up there. How might we reform the EU enough to allow Ukraine to come in?
So I want to ask you about Britain and what's going to happen here. But we're going to have a quick fire round first. What's the job you wish you'd had, Peter?
Permsec of DFID.
Oh yes. Well, bring it back, and we'll arrange for you to be appointed.
In that role, you get the Treasury coming to say how much more money would you like, which is not my experience in the Foreign Office.
Let me just give you a brief advert here. Peter has kindly agreed to write some blurb for my new book, which is called The Rise and Fall of the Department for International Development, which is published on the 3rd of October. It's never too early to pre-order on Amazon. It's available now on Amazon. Ambassador, Permanent Secretary, or National Security Advisor?
Oh, ambassador to Paris, all-round life-enhancing experience.
Okay. Well, you just answered my next one, France or Britain?
Both.
Right, very good. And I've given you a hint for this one as well. Who is going to win the football Euros starting next month?
I have not the slightest idea. I'm afraid I'm not a football type at all, so I'm going to pass on that one.
It's going to be Kylian Mbappe. You heard it here first.
There you are. I'm glad I didn't answer.
Peter, what's the best book you've read this year?
Something that I think might interest some people here. There's a very interesting book by a professor called Henrietta Harrison called The Interpreters, The Art of Interpreting, something like that. Perils of Interpreting. It's about the Chinese Jesuit priest who accompanied McCartney on his mission to Beijing in 1792. And was usually the only person in the room who spoke both languages, neither side having a word of the other's language. And it's about the power of an interpreter, the risks of an interpreter putting themselves in that position between cultures. And she goes on to talk interestingly about interpreters and translators. And it made me think, for example, of the Afghans, some of whom are still there, and the interpreters who had to interpret for us between Chinese and English in the Hong Kong negotiations. The position of interpreter is an ambiguous one, a very exposed one, can be a dangerous one, but an absolutely essential one, because you have to interpret the culture as well as the language. It's a very interesting book, Henrietta Harrison, The Perils of Interpreting.
Fantastic, thank you. Gardening or opera viewing?
One after the other. I wouldn't want to give up either.
What are you looking forward to seeing at the Paris Olympics?
My garden.
You won't be watching it?
We have a house in Normandy, and I think the place to watch the Paris Olympics from is Normandy. Given how Paris is on any given summer day anyway, if you add 8 million visitors for the Olympics, I think I'm not going to be there.
Okay.
So I'd watch it on TV.
Okay. Favourite statesman?
Sir Alec Cadogan. You may not have heard of him unless you've read my book. The permanent secretary in the Foreign Office during the war, who went to all the big summits with Churchill, who was with Churchill when he went to the first summit with Roosevelt in Placentia Bay in Canada, where Roosevelt said, I think we need a declaration on the principles of the peace after this war. This is 1941. And he wrote out what then became the Atlantic Charter, much of which was then exported into the UN Charter. The principles of the UN Charter, many of them are rooted in the Atlantic Charter, which was written by Alec Cadogan. When I was Perm Sec in the Foreign Office, I had on the wall the draft of the Atlantic Charter that he'd written out more or less on a warship in the Atlantic with Churchill's amendments that went on to the Atlantic Charter. A great, great man, not much known, but a real force not only during the war, but in shaping the post-war institutions.
At the school I went to for most of my schooling, the junior house for girls and boys was called Cadogan House. And now I know more about him than I did in any of the previous 60 years, so thank you very much.
It may not have been, his dad was the Earl of Cadogan, who owned a large part of Chelsea.
Right.
So he wasn't particularly hard up, but he was a wonderful man.
Okay, fantastic. Right, let's talk a bit about the UK and prospects and what we'd like to see in terms of the way the UK plays its role in the world. Firstly, if, as most people expect, Keir Starmer's the Prime Minister from the 15th or 22nd of November, what will be different about Britain's engagement in the world?
Well, it'll feel more normal. I mean, we've come through a period of extraordinary abnormality with our retreat from the world since 2016. There were many reasons why people voted yes or no on the Brexit decision, but the pulling up the bridges, the retreat, the sense that Britain was no longer a significant international player while we went into 4 or 5 years of psychodrama and basically weren't active on the world stage, that is over, I think, with Starmer. And the idea that anything to do with the European Union is anathema and cannot be mentioned in polite society, that will be over as well. So I think we'll see an improvement in the tone towards Europe. The substance will take longer, I think. And for the rest, I think the problem for a Labour Foreign Secretary is going to be, so what is going to be different? Because I think on Ukraine, on Gaza, on China, on Russia, they will essentially adopt the same policy as this government. I think rightly in many ways, because on Europe the tone will be much more constructive, and then the other area of difference will be on migration, of course, and borders, where they will scrub the Rwanda deal, but are still struggling to answer the question, okay, you don't like Rwanda, so what will you do yourselves? And I think that is a more difficult question. But a return to normality, and a team who will have spent the last 2 or 3 years thinking about the issues, as we know, consulting former old and bold around, and coming in with ideas and initiatives ready to go.
Okay.
That will be a relief.
One of the, I think one of their big problems myself, and this was exposed at a dinner that Gus O'Donnell, who used to be the Cabinet Secretary, had with a bunch of former permanent secretaries. I think you and Suzanne must have been in France. Yes,
we were away, we were, yes.
Anyway, the older and bolder, in your phrase, who were there, people like John Sawers and Nigel Crisp and Simon Fraser, one of the things they all said, and this I have to say is my experience as well, having sat through the whole of the Brexit fandango in New York, watching in closed private meetings while world leaders laughed among themselves about what this country was doing. One of the things that's going to be really, really hard is how we try to recover and restore our reputation, how we move on from being what we became for a brief period, a laughingstock. So one of the questions and in my own sort of engagement with Starmer's office and Sue and people like that, I've been trying to encourage them to think about is what few things can you do that get you along the long journey of restoring the country's international reputation. So my question to you, Peter, is not what will they do, but what should they do beyond the basics which you've talked about?
Well, I think a lot of it is the basics, actually, because I think David Cameron has reminded us how you can be an effective foreign secretary. He seems to be more or less delegated foreign affairs by Sunak, and my goodness, he's thrown himself into it. He's out there all the time. He travels constantly. Doesn't have a constituency, of course, because he's in my house. And he's working hard, seriously, bringing the ideas from the Foreign Office to the table. He's got experience, he's got gravitas, he looks like a leader. He's prepared to take some risk and go out ahead of other people. He said something about being prepared to recognize a Palestinian state recently, which I think hadn't been government policy. And I think he's already done quite a bit to move us out of the laughingstock category. I think on Ukraine, on Gaza, we're not in the laughingstock category,
right.
And that's good. And indeed, even in Europe, I think things are getting a bit more normal. So I think the first thing for a foreign secretary and a team to do is to run a tight ship with some clear messages, some clear priorities. Can't do everything, but what you do choose as a priority, work hard and consistently at it. Show up, be there, come with ideas, come with some money if you can possibly find some money from what's left of the development budget. And I think that already is doing good for Britain's reputation. And sustain it. The best thing would be to leave the team there for 5 years. So it was the same person, not changing the Minister for Europe or the Foreign Minister or the Defence Secretary every year or two. I think that in itself would do a lot. And if the government also stopped rumbling about breaking international law and leaving international treaties, which I think Labour would do, that will do a lot as well.
Yeah.
Practice what we preach.
Right.
No good preaching respect for international law if you're talking about breaking it at home.
Okay. So we might pursue some of those themes, and I might test you out on a few other things they could do. But
yeah.
let's just give everybody else in the room a chance to ask whatever they would like to ask. Nikki has the mic. If you'd like to make a contribution or ask a question, please gesticulate wildly, and we will see you.
Very good.
Gary in the front here, and then Stephen, and then I think Martin.
Thanks so much. I'll hold it over here.
Oh, what's that?
Or I can speak very loudly. Okay. No, it's not. It's probably me. I'll just speak loudly.
Very good.
Thank you very much. A scintillating exchange. And my question focuses squarely on the UN. And it's, you know, I'd say in today's very competitive global context, which you've outlined, what would you say are the elements that would allow the United Nations to reach its 100th birthday engaged and purposeful, rather than, as many of us fear, being consigned to the shadowlands of irrelevance?
Well, I mean, its key advantage is its universality. And I don't think in today's fractured world you could set up any organization on anything that would have universal consent. You'd never get China, Russia, America, others to agree on anything in terms of institutional structure. So that's its great advantage. It exists, it is universal, and many of the worst problems facing the planet are universal problems. So if you look at the climate conference, for example, it's rooted in the UN. You know, it's a UNFCCC, and any climate convention would have to come to the General Assembly to be ratified. And that's going to be true of any global agreement on anything, on cybersecurity, on AI, on any of the big challenges facing us, as well as health, where we've discovered health is a universal issue. You know, that a disease originating somewhere in China can become a global pandemic in a few months. And the UN is the only body that can possibly provide a forum for dealing with any of that. So it will survive if the member states are prepared to take it seriously, to take the governance seriously, to take the funding seriously, particularly the specialized agencies. That's my feeling. And you know, we've got to somehow assemble the political will to do that, because if it does fall into becoming a dusty, cobwebby corner of institutional history, there will be no global institutions to cope with the global problems the planet faces.
Very good, thank you. Stephen.
I'm not sure if I'm going to cause feedback.
You're good so far.
My name is Stephen Rudgard, ex-FAO. I have felt for a while that Ukraine and Gaza have drawn the public's attention away from Africa.
Yeah.
Sudan, Congo, the Sahel. Not exactly in all cases failed governments, but institutions severely undermined. But what's your, in a nutshell, future perspective for those very populous countries, their stability, their economic development, their social development, with the attention so focused elsewhere? It's barely that Sudan even gets a mention.
Yeah.
I'd add Tigray, by the way, and Ethiopia to the list as well.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, Ethiopia, of course, and is it going to spread south?
Right.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Well, it's not an area I'm an expert in, to be absolutely honest. I'm more an expert in the areas that you mentioned. And I think it's inevitable that when war comes to Europe, the Europeans are going to be very focused on that. I think it's unfortunate, as you say, because these things are crucial. I'd add another thing to the list, which is the collapse of the Western position in the Sahel. Overrun now, essentially, by Islamist extremists, aided, of course, by Russia, Wagner, and all the rest of it. You know, I can't sit here and say I'm confident that that's going to change anytime soon. I think until we can get Israel-Gaza wrestled to some kind of a ceasefire and a post-conflict period, by the way, in which the UN is going to have to play a major role, and Ukraine to some sort of stability, I don't think the West, you know, the Europeans and the Americans particularly, are going to have much bandwidth to cope with anything else. It's the honest answer. And so then the field is left to those who want to stir up trouble, like the Russians, or those who want to capitalize, like the Chinese. And I don't honestly know how much role the Chinese are playing in these areas. Not much to reduce the conflict, no doubt, but certainly to position themselves to benefit in terms of access to raw materials or whatever else for the future. So I share your gloomy analysis. And the only voice I know in the British public debate that is really putting these issues on the table lives in New York, and that's David Miliband. And David comes over here from time to time, makes a coruscating speech in which he reminds us all of these terrible things, and then goes back to New York, tries to deal with them. But there's no British politician, I think, who's really focusing on that. If it had been Tony Blair coming into office next year, then Africa would have been higher up. But in the Starmer Lamy landscape, I don't think it figures very high. So I share your concern, worry that it's not getting the attention it deserves.
I think it's a great question, Stephen, actually, and it's worth reminding ourselves that in the second half of this century, most of the children born on the planet will be African children.
Right.
As it happens, I'm gonna ask for help now. I'm going to be spending 6 months from late October this year, early November, being hosted by a Stiftung in Berlin on very generous terms. If they ever ask you to do this, to bite their hand off, because it's a fantastic deal. And the topic I've agreed to give some thought to is exactly the one that you talked about, Stephen. What should Europe, and Germany in particular as the leader of Europe, be thinking about in terms of planning its relationship with Africa over the next 2 generations? So if you could all please email your answers to that question into me, you'll find them reloaded in my my product from this Stiftung thing. Martin, sorry Peter.
I'm just very interested, as you pass by, to hear your throwaway phrase there, Germany, leader of Europe. That's interesting. That's interesting.
Do you think that's not right?
Well, I think Germany's in a considerable mess. So if we're looking for Germany for leadership, we're looking in the wrong place.
Okay.
Germany are completely submerged at the moment in their own psychodramas, to use that word. Scholz is weak. The budget crisis is serious. It's behind the curve on China. It's struggling on Ukraine. The person who likes to see themselves as the leader of Europe, of course, is next door, Emmanuel Macron.
And how's that been going in the Sahel?
He's got the ideas, but the follow-through doesn't always go so well.
Yeah.
Sorry,
that's a very good point. And
there is no leader
Ursula
of
von der
Europe.
Leyen is going to have to work out how to manage all this, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Martin Barber, please.
Thank you. Yes, Martin Barber. I'd like to ask you a quick two-parter, if I may.
Of course.
Short two-parter. First part, would you agree that in the contest between our arms manufacturers on the one hand and the human rights lobby on the other, over whether we should be selling arms to countries with doubtful human rights records, the arms manufacturers almost always win out? And if you would agree with that, is there any advice that you could give to the human rights lobby on how to be more successful in this apparently unequal contest?
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Well, that's an excellent question as well, my goodness. Yes, well, I think you're probably right. When you say arms manufacturers, the sort of merchants of death, it puts them in the worst possible light. The politicians would say those who are employing 70 or 80,000 people in key constituencies and areas where there aren't many good jobs. It's very useful for BAE to be producing its aircraft in the northwest of England and so on. So yes, but the whole lobby in favour of the arms industry does tend to win out. You're right. I was one of the first to speak out, actually, among the old and bold, for the government to suspend arms deliveries to Israel. A month or two ago, I said it on the Today programme and got a certain amount of flack. However, on the same day, 600 judges and lawyers then published a letter saying the same thing. And I think it's a flagrant case, actually, where, although that is not a major arms export market for the UK, we could have sent a signal of principle that our criteria for exporting say we expect a country to observe international humanitarian law, and I don't think Israel passes that test. So, but so far they've flunked that. The big case, of course, is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, there was a brief suspension, as you remember, at the height of the Saudis attacking. Can we remember? Actually, it was the Houthis, wasn't it? Well, now we're attacking the Houthis, and so the boot's on the other foot, and the suspension was lifted. I think it is really hard when there are people with a very strong economic case for continuing sales of arms to other countries, for the human rights lobby to speak up. I think with the Starmer government, you probably get a bit more of a hearing for the human rights lobby, and so keep reminding people that the arms export criteria are very clear on the values and principles that we should be applying, Robin Cook, who I worked for back in the day, had some problems with consistency on arms exports as well, but at least he did fight the fight there. So, I mean, broadly, I think you're right, but I think the machine, the tools are there in what the government have set as their criteria to hold them to account on it.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you.
Oh, that one seems to be a problem.
I am Arturo Martinez from the Greenwich region. My questions have to do with the UN and the use of atomic power. I think one of the things that worry everybody and don't take it up is the use of atomic powers, especially in Crimea and in Russia and in the war in Ukraine. Now, how the UN can contribute to, I don't think you would say avoid, but try not to use atomic power in these conflicts that we have today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And by atomic power, you mean nuclear weapons, really,
Yes.
because nuclear energy is something that we are although they do come together somewhere. Well, first of all, I think the IAEA is playing a hugely important role in inspection of nuclear facilities and transparency on what's going on. And if you take the case of Iran, the IAEA inspectors have been material in pushing back the point at which Iran would say it had a nuclear weapon. I mean, for years when I worked in the Foreign Office, we were told it was 3 years away from getting a nuclear weapon. And that was 20 years ago. And now perhaps they're 2 years away. But the process of inspection, with all the international backing that has in Vienna, that has helped. So international involvement as far as possible. The NPT, of course, is an absolutely vital tool for limiting proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world. You know, it hasn't been perfect, but it is still pretty extraordinary that since it was adopted in, I think, 1968, you know, the number of new nuclear weapon states is very, very small. And at a time when it was adopted, I think we thought nuclear weapons would spread much more widely. So the limitation of nuclear weapons has been a pretty successful international effort, and the UN, through the NPT, is playing an important part in that, the UN Conference on Disarmament as well. But at the end of the day, there's only so much the UN can do, because if great countries decide to launch nuclear weapon programs, you know, they will do so. It's also worth remembering that in terms of Russia saber-rattling on nuclear weapons, as Putin has been doing, the most effective pressure on him to stop it has come from the Chinese. Xi Jinping seems to be the one who said to Putin, you know, don't go there. And that seemed to have an effect. So peer group pressure is also quite important in maintaining nuclear deterrence.
Okay, so I'm going to issue my next plea for free advice now, Peter. I have to talk to the media this afternoon about the pandemic treaty, which is in the final stage of negotiation in Geneva, ahead of the World Health Assembly, which is just about to start. And the British government has, not least through the guise of one of our former colleagues, David Frost, in the Daily Telegraph, started to put the boot in the negotiation of this treaty. So I wonder, what is the best response to people who seem quickly to have forgotten the failures of collaboration in the COVID-19 pandemic? What's the best response to people who think it's a bad idea for the world to collaborate in dealing with these kinds of problems in future, particularly because if you believe the excellent reports of the brilliant Global Preparedness and Monitoring Board, the risk of pandemic is in fact growing now. It's not depleted by the COVID-19 experience.
One of the fundamental problems in democratic politics, I think, is getting anyone to pay attention to the risk of something that could happen but hasn't yet happened. I write about it a bit in my book. The constant problem of the immediate crisis drawing attention away from the longer term risk goes on all the time. I mean, that was perhaps understandable in the case of pandemic preparedness, Although when we set up the National Security Council that you referred to in 2010, we did a national security risk assessment. And in the top tier risks in 2010, in the strategy we published, we put pandemic as one of the 4, alongside flooding. We said natural hazards, pandemic. Well, flooding happens every year, so the money went to flooding defences. It didn't go to pandemic preparedness. So we weren't ready for the pandemic in the 2019. Now we haven't got that excuse, but it is still not the immediate threat. And it's a bit similar to the point about Africa. You know, it's not the threat in front of Western politicians. I mean, I think the answer is that you've got to be preparing for foreseeable crises that aren't punching you in the nose right now. And there are politicians, you don't need to reference David Frost, but he's one of them, who tends to think that international agreements or anything are a waste of time. Well, I think that the last pandemic showed that that was completely wrong. So I think we do need now to use whatever interval we've got before the next one to make sure we're not caught short again.
I think it is quite instructive that the far right of the Conservative Party, who, as you say, have stopped Britain joining Germany, Canada, Australia, everyone else in refunding UNRWA, are also banging on this gig on pandemic. And these are the folk who bought us Brexit after all. So, so that is a significant part in the national politics still.
There's a strand of opinion in British politics that think international agreements are basically a bad idea and a waste of time. You know, we don't need all this structure and these international fora and so on. We just need to cope day by day with things. I mean, it's a bit Trumpian, actually, because also Trump thinks the same thing, that international institutions are a waste of time and, you know, we're better just pulling up the drawbridge and being America. So it's a sort of isolationism and a sort of libertarian sense that we don't need the world to help us sort out our problems. I mean, I suspect all that will change in 6 months in the UK, so I'm not sure that the voice of Lord Frost will have quite the same carrying power then. He'll still write for the Daily Telegraph, but you know, it will be to a relatively limited audience. No, I think it's vital to keep making the case for governments to worry about issues that are perhaps just off the edge of the radar screen but could come onto it any time.
Maybe David will get back to the thing he was really good at, which was selling Scotch whisky.
Yeah. Exactly.
Now, if you would like, anybody out there who'd like questions, I'm not seeing them at the moment, otherwise I'm going to keep going with my list of questions for Peter.
Surely provoked somebody to... somebody needs to challenge me on what I've been saying, because I'm very, very happy to be corrected.
Robert. I hope you're going to ask your constitution question, Robert, because that's good.
Oh my gosh.
It's going to come up sometime. I really enjoyed your book, and I'm going to order yours, of course, Mark. I've enjoyed this updating very much. But one of the themes that came through in your book was the absence of strategic thinking.
Yes.
And actually, that's just what you've been talking about. Thinking 10, 15, 20 years ahead of what we should be focusing on now with a view to the future. I wonder what 2 or 3 structural or process changes you would suggest for the UK polity to make that more likely. I realise there's a lot of it is individual, like your description of David Cameron seems to be right, although I'm reluctant to say that. but he seems to be doing that right as Foreign Secretary. But if you can get away from the individuals, what are the processes or structures which could be improved? One of the points you make in your book is citizen assemblies. I have my reservations about citizens assemblies for this kind of integrated, highly complex strategic thinking, particularly maybe for focused issues, possibly, but for that strategic thinking I think they probably have their limitations. So what else?
Very good.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Well, it's a very thoughtful question indeed. So on strategic thinking, I think it's something fundamental about modern democratic politics that makes it really hard. Because everyone lives under what I call in my book the tyranny of the immediate. And it just accelerates all the time. So if you're an elected politician, I mean, your absolute focus, of course, is on getting re-elected, and that timeline comes in all the time. You are subjected to just a barrage of incoming information, events, problems, on social media, on 24/7 media, in Parliament, from the markets, from all directions. And so you kind of stagger from one, oh my God, what am I going to do, to the next one. And you have no time really to think out beyond that. And so I think the whole process of politics in democratic countries makes that extremely difficult. I think there are one or two other things about it as well. I think politicians by and large hate making choices. Choices are dangerous. You leave somebody disappointed. You know, you make a choice in the cabinet, so the person who loses might become an enemy, and so the temptation to just muddle through and let life itself decide things is quite strong. Often if you put off a problem, it sort of solves itself and you don't have to make a decision, and you don't have to avoid splitting your delicate coalition in your cabinet. I think the UK has a particular problem, because so much power for a British Prime Minister depends on a majority in Parliament. If you've got that majority, you can do whatever you like, as Boris Johnson showed. Conventions or no conventions, you can just roll over them if you've got a parliamentary majority. And so your whole purpose in life is to maintain your parliamentary majority. And again, that means probably avoiding difficult choices. It means doing ambiguous deals that keep things on the road. It tends to mean that people who rise to that function are great communicators, tacticians, maneuverers, not strategic thinkers. There's nothing in the kind of Darwinian natural selection for parliamentary leaders in our system to prioritize strategic thinking. And so you get these people who come to the top who are basically just, muddling through. And that's a real problem, I think, when we come to this. And thinking back in UK politics, the last time I can remember a really good strategic analysis followed by decision goes back to something called the Future Policy Study, which Macmillan commissioned in 1959, reported in 1960. It was after Suez, and it was just after the Treaty of Rome, and he realized that things were changing pretty dramatically. And he sent the Cabinet Secretary and the Chief of Defence Staff and all the great men of the day inside government away for a year to come up with a report. And it's a really tough, hard-hitting report, top secret, and of course didn't leak, which is useful. But it basically said, we really risk being outrun by this new European thing that's developing, and Suez showed that our relationship with the Americans are weak, so we need to double down on both. And Macmillan took that seriously. He went away over Christmas, thought about it. He went to see de Gaulle and lodged the first application to join the EEC. De Gaulle said no, but at least Macmillan acted. And then the same week, he went to Nassau in the Bahamas to sign the Polaris deal with the Americans, which locked us into the American-UK strategic relationship. And so that's an example of strategic thinking followed by action and decision. And I can't think of many since then. I mean, we've taken decisions to retreat from east of Suez, to join the European Union and so on, but that was the last real moment. And the kind of moment I could have seen for strategic thinking would have been when Theresa May came into office after the Brexit vote, with no consensus in the country at all what people thought they meant by Brexit. If she had taken a year out then to have, come on to citizens' assemblies, but some sort of national commission or something which tried to pull the country together to say, okay, what kind of relationship do we want with our European neighbours? That would have been an opportunity for real strategic thinking, and it was missed. So I think there's a real problem. One last coda on strategic thinking. People say the authoritarians do it better because they don't have public opinion, so they're not pulled in different directions. Okay, that's true. However, because they're not contested in debate and discussion, their strategic decisions can be absolutely awful ones and crash the country. I mean, as Putin is in the process of doing on Ukraine. So there's no easy answer to it. Citizens' assemblies, I talked about it a bit, as you say in my book. The French use it a bit. The French used it, they call it a convention, which of course has roots going back to the revolution, for a broad national discussion. They have something even broader, they call it the grand débat, where they had thousands of meetings about how to come out of the gilets jaunes tensions and where to reduce taxes, what changes to make. They had a convention on climate change with 150 citizens. chosen at random. They had another one recently on assisted dying, and then Macron is now bringing forward a law on assisted dying. The Irish use it a bit. They used it for a citizens' assembly to talk about the issue of legalized abortion, and again then introduced a law. So I think they are useful for a public debate on a fairly clearly defined issue to produce recommendations. It's difficult for a government if they produce recommendations that the government doesn't then want to take up, of course. But I put it there because I thought that we need a wider public discussion of the issues of national security, really. It's still a bit of an art form that goes on in corridors in Whitehall and behind closed doors and secret and so on, whereas actually the decisions taken in a National Security Council about pandemic preparedness or counterterrorism or AI or how to deal with Russia affect all citizens. And I saw it perhaps as a way of engaging younger people, wider group of citizens in the debate about Britain's place in the world. Not as a decision-making forum, of course, but as an ideas-generating forum.
That was a brilliant and wide-ranging and insightful answer, I must say. I just wanted to offer one observation on what you said about autocrats, and they don't have to listen to public opinion.
Yes. Yes.
I went to Moscow a few times when I was working for the UN, and twice they invited me to the control room of the emergency response ministry. This is something set up by Shoigu, who used to be the defense, who then became the defense minister.
Yes.
And I went into this this control room, which has the biggest bank of huge TV screens I've ever seen anywhere in the world. And in front of the bank of TV screens is there's about 30 big white leather chairs. It's like something out of James Bond, actually, all looking forward into the control screen. So I said to them, so just tell me who sits where when you've got a big emergency, who sits where? And a lot of the seats had labels on them. So the chemical engineer were identified, the nuclear engineer were identified, the logistics people were identified, and there were these two seats at the front which didn't have name tags. I mean, obviously they were all in Russian and they were translating them for me, but there were these two seats which didn't have name tags attached to them. So I said, okay, so who sits there then? And it turned out the two people who sat there were firstly the psychologists whose job it was to forecast how public would react to things. And the second seat were the communication specialists whose job it was to manage how people would react to things. Because, of course, one of the truths about autocratic regimes is they do have to keep the populace more or less on side, even if they do it in a rather different way to the way we do it in the West.
Yes, yes, I think that's true. But, you know, for all that, Putin made an appallingly bad decision on Ukraine, completely failed to foresee the outcome, I think because of corruption in his secret services and so on. So, yes, they can command the resources, and they can take decisions, but if they're the wrong decisions, then the whole country pays.
Do you think that's how they feel in Russia at the moment? Some analysts think that Putin has done quite well in building a war economy in which many people have a stake because there's loads of jobs, and he's been quite successful in mobilizing national opinion. Do you think that's a wrong assessment?
Well, I think nobody knows really what national opinion is in Russia because it sort of doesn't exist. Nobody dares speak up. I think he's been successful in mobilizing a war economy in the short term, yes. And of course, some people will be profiting from that. They always do in war economies. But I think he's distorting and twisting the Russian economy out of shape. He's not getting any Western investment. He's cut off from the financial system. I said he's been pushed into the arms of China. He must be weakening the potential, the growth potential in the Russian economy over the next 10 or 15 years because he's not getting the technology, he's not getting the investment. All he's doing is manufacturing endless rounds of munitions, and they've taken huge casualties. So, I mean, I suspect that he's done well in a short-term war economy response, but over the long term, Russia will pay the price for that and become increasingly the junior partner to China across the board. And I wonder whether there aren't quite strong feelings around in Russia about, has all this been worthwhile? Because it's the dream of the Tsar to, reunite the motherland. But if people are, watching their living standards and their life expectancies decline because of lack of investment and so on, that may not be such a good thing. So I think the jury is out on that, honestly.
Okay. So you touched earlier on AI, and I know you're not an expert. You would say yourself you're not an expert on AI, but
Certainly
you do
not.
have insight and you do have wisdom. So
Well, I don't know.
the question I get asked when I do events a lot on AI at the moment is, how do we work out whether this extraordinary technological revolution is more likely to be the answer to all our problems or the seeds of our own destruction? And
Yes.
how do we try to manage it in a way that makes it the former and not the latter?
Right, and of course I have no insight into it at all, except my instinct is it will be neither of those. That as with other huge inventions and breakthroughs, it will have both positive and negative consequences that will play out over time. Like the invention of the combustion engine, electricity, the internet, the telephone. People feared all of those things. Think of the Luddites and so on. And, technology has always been feared. This technology is very powerful, yes. I suspect that its dangers are being a bit overplayed, in fact, and that good old human judgment will, in the end, continue to be important. I think it will have major effects in the job market, because I think it's bound to lead to another wave of job losses, of less skilled process workers, which we've seen before. Globalization led to huge losses of traditional skilled industrial work across many, many countries, and that has had political impacts. I think it's one of the drivers behind populism, that people felt that they didn't have as good a job as their parents, they didn't have the same life expectation in former industrial areas across many countries. And I think AI is bound to have a similar effect in the job market. And so, what are all our young people going to do? How are we going to find them useful, worthwhile work and employment in the future? I think it's going to be a real question. I think it could have enormous benefits. I'm far from understanding the science, medical science, for example, diagnostics and so on, but there could be breakthroughs there. So I suspect it'll be both. In the areas I'm interested in, sort of security, defense, it's bound to have impacts there as well. It's going to further increase the tempo of warfare. We're seeing that in Ukraine at the moment. It's all going to be done by drones and by algorithms, and anybody who puts a foot out of cover in the battlefield risks being hit. So it'll change warfare. Maybe it'll make warfare less attractive for people because even weaker countries will be able to weaponize technology cheaply to defend themselves. I think all those kind of effects are a bit unpredictable, but I think it'll have effects on both sides of the ledger, both positive and negative. Quite where the balance comes out, I don't know, but I don't think it's the end of humanity. I mean, at the end of the day, if things get bad enough, you can always pull the plug out of the wall and the computer will stop. So.
Until they work out how to put it back in. Because,
themselves, yeah.
Yes. So, this is my next question in the search for high-quality, free expert advice. One of my other roles, which I'm just taking over from Richard Dearlove, our former colleague who used to run MI6, is as chair of the Board of Trustees of the University of London.
Oh, gosh.
And what the University of London does, mostly, apart from running Senate House and providing corporate services for the LSE and UCL and all the constituent members, is it runs a system for students around the world to get University of London degrees by remote learning and distance learning. And it seems to me that this is a fantastic asset for the UK, part of UK PLC, and we ought to be trying to work out the best way to get the current number of students from 50,000 up to 500,000 or 1 million, because in many countries there's a burgeoning of youth population who want to get an education and their home universities can't meet it. What do you think are the real prospects in that area from your observation of how the country is viewed? And what other free tips and advice do you have for the incoming chair of the Board of Trustees of the University of London?
Well, I mean, it puts two issues on the table, doesn't it? One is British soft power, which I think is a very interesting issue, to speak to former Permsec of DFID and to people who've been part of sort of global British soft power in your deployment in the international institutions. And I think it is one of the frustrations of governments that there is this thing called soft power, but they can't quite locate where it is. and they don't feel that they can control it and shape it and direct it. So it lies in the universities, in the BBC, in the British Council, in the arts, and culture, football, sports, films. You know, it's widely diffused, but there is a disproportionate British impact globally, I think, from our soft power writ large like that, and the university sector is very much part of that. And this government seems to be doing everything they can to undermine the university sector, especially with their controls on students coming from abroad. I mean, from the EU, almost complete cut-off, from everywhere else put off by the astronomical costs of sending young people to the UK. And yet, I think the university sector in the UK remains globally very attractive. So one of the answers probably is remote learning, and capitalising on the fact that the British brand, I think, is still very strong. I don't quite know how you do that, but I think that there's a really useful thing there. I mean, we've seen over the years and decades, Suzanne as well, the British Council and the power of the English language exam system, teaching system. I think the Council are more or less funding themselves now on the proceeds of ELT around the world. Again, you know, any other country that had the brand of the British Council or the BBC World Service would be funding it much more generously. So I think it's a real opportunity, yes, to promote the British university sector in ways that don't require young people to come to this country, coupled with active lobbying of the incoming government to put right the obvious wrongs, like leaving the Erasmus programme,
Right.
which would open the door again to thousands of European university students coming here, thousands of Brits going to the continent. Of course it has a cost, but it's an opportunity cost, and the opportunity has been missed in the decision making so far. That's also part of it. I'm sure the University of London, like others, will do with an influx of European students too. Well, I would definitely go for the distance learning as at least a short-term answer to the problem of the UK being starved of international students.
Just on Erasmus, lots of people were surprised that Keir Starmer closed down so quickly that issue of student mobility.
Yeah.
Why? Was that just tactical?
Yeah, I think it was. This was actually turned out to be a Commission idea circulated to EU member states, saying, what if we made the Brits an offer of a youth mobility visa? I think it was a tactical thing from them because they saw signs of the UK doing individual deals with European countries.
Right.
So we did an individual deal with France on school visits to allow collective travel documents for school visits. And I think the Commission got worried that we might succeed in picking off, you know, individual European countries. I mean, it was a terrible piece of timing, because of course it played straight into the UK media and the UK electoral debate. And the government immediately moved to shut it down, saying it sounded like free movement by the back door, which it's not, because it's require a visa, you know, it would be capped at numbers and so on. And the Labour Party also moved very rapidly to say no. When I asked them, off the record if you don't mind, they said, well, you know, look at the electoral timetable. We don't want to give our adversaries any stick to beat us with by misrepresenting us as trying to get free movement going again via the back door. So we thought it was safer to say no. And I interpret that to mean after the election, if they come in with a reasonable majority, they will be prepared to look again at that.
Right.
Because I don't think they have a problem with the principle. I think it's the risk of being seen to say anything positive about anything in Europe other than defence and security, where they've talked about a security pact. I think they think that's safe ground. But they just saw this as a potential banana skin. I hope that that can be revisited, because the youth mobility visa, allowing a certain number of young people to work, to study, you know, just to hang out in each other's countries for a year or two, is such a good thing.
Yes.
And the risk of, you know, people wanting to stay on and so on is pretty minor. So I hope that they will revisit that.
Very good. Another question from the floor.
Yeah, let's try that. Well, just a quick comment actually, so Peter, on this, regarding the distribution of information and access to university and learning. One of the key technologies, many people remember actually, access to information, access to news. You remember Second World with the BBC News being distributed on HF all around the world. You could capable
and receive information.
Yeah.
Right now, there's a new technology around satellite connectivity. And you mentioned Ukraine war. One of the key technology keeping Ukraine somehow superior or making informed decision was the Starlink system.
Starlink. Yes,
that was a key technology.
Yeah.
Now that system is being rolled out all over the globe. I mean, it would be a good thing for the UN to think about having that as an agenda very high up to get access to as many people as possible through satellite, because that would be a big impact on the abilities in developing countries and all over the world to get access to university, talking about soft power, distance learning. Key thing is broadband internet connection, affordable, working worldwide.
Yeah.
You need a few things to do that. You need to have the frequencies available in different countries, so ITU need to be involved in these kind of things, and it will have a big impact for a better world.
It could have, I think I would say. I mean, at the moment, as you know, the access to things like Starlink are controlled by, one or two super rich billionaires who seem to decide at their breakfast table, whether this part of Ukraine or that part will continue to have access to Starlink. So at the moment, it seems to be controlled by oligarchs rather than by altruistic organizations, which may be one of the problems, because also the technology, yes, is clearly very important. What is put on it will be a source of contention and argument, both with the private sector providers of these satellites and also no doubt among the states, because I can imagine that Chinese and Russian propaganda will be actively using these sorts of channels, as well as good information from Western sources. So I can see it's another battleground for the endless battle of ideas and ideologies.
I get that point, certainly. And the point you made about a few people controlling these things is true. But there is the technology and the competing system built up. The point is not is that the international community is actually getting active from that point of view, that this technology doesn't end up in the hands of a few people.
Yeah.
And you might know, for example, you mentioned China. China was on board Galileo initially on these navigation systems worldwide. It actually went down to build their own system quickly in a couple of years. It's now having most of the satellites out there. And so there's something for the international community to do about it. If not, we're going to be left out on this.
Yeah.
So this is really something which has to be put attention on.
Well, it's a very important point. It's not what I'm an expert in. The problem is the international community finds it so very hard to assert itself against these well-funded state actors or private sector actors who are dominating the space. And the international community, in the shape of the UN, doesn't have the resources to do that. You're right. I mean, it ought to be a common good for humanity, and a place where access to useful, objective information, learning should be available. And that sounds like what the internet was supposed to be like, and that has not proved to be as successful as the scientists who invented it first hoped.
But it's still useful, isn't it?
It's still useful, but I mean, it's also incredibly useful for those who want to propagandize, create fake news, subvert, distort, or radicalize our societies. So, rather like I tried to say with AI, it's got both positives and negatives, and we have to work to make the positives, stronger than the negatives.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Very interesting conversation there. So I've got two more questions, Peter, I want to ask you before we liberate you. Are you in that? Do you need to be back in the House of Lords today, or is it?
Yeah, but that's all right.
So
no hurry.
There's
actually no hurry. No hurry.
So my penultimate question is: do you think that Francis Fukuyama has any regrets at all about writing his book, The End of History, or was he laughing so hard all the way to the bank that he's not bothered?
He's recanted a bit since, I think, in a subsequent book. Yeah. I mean, just to go back to it, it was actually first an article, and I think it was probably better as an article than a book. And it was an article that came out in a point that was not sort of random. It was 1989. Exactly. By the way, it also had a question mark, end of history question mark in the article. It went at the time of the book. And in 1989, I think, excuse me, the argument that the war of ideologies is over. We've won the war of ideas. You know, the liberal democratic idea has won. Communism is no longer, it's flat on the floor. It was a sort of neocon idea of the time. The march of freedom has succeeded. I mean, it was an arguable case then. He overstated it, I think. I think he overstated it even more in his book. But of course it was wrong, because ideology is back. Islamic ideology, if you can call it that, ideas anyway, and of course the ideas of Xi Jinping that you can be economically successful while being politically extremely repressive, that combination, which we didn't believe was likely in 1989, has proved to be very likely. So yeah, I think he missed the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of Islamic extremism, which are now dividing our world again, and history is back working full time.
Right.
So I think, it was one of those, it was a zeitgeist thing at the moment. It had a plausibility, sold a lot of books, but he turned out to be wrong.
Yeah, very good, thank you. Okay, so my last question is this. Some people, Robin Butler, actually, a previous Cabinet Secretary, is in
Yes.
this category, think that there's something a little bit naff and infradig about people like you and me pontificating in public and publishing books on public policy, because we had careers as the insiders, the behind-the-scenes folks, the public servants and the civil servants, and so on. And really, we should keep our advice private to the politicians rather than engage in the public debate. So my question to you, which I ask because although I think the judgments I'm making in my new book are very close to the centre of gravity, I hope they are, and there's a lot, certainly I know a lot of cross-party agreement on some of them. This is not a book that's going to get me on Boris Johnson's Christmas card list.
No. Well,
so,
take that as a badge of honour, I think.
Well, so what's our best defence to those people who complain about the fact that people like you and I engage in conversations like this in public or appear on the media when we're supposed to be the behind-the-scenes guys?
Well, I mean, it's a legitimate point. Although Robin Butler himself, I hear on the media from time to time,
Yes.
so he's not completely doesn't entirely resist it. I mean, I think that in the world that we live in, it seems entirely natural that people should, after they've retired, they don't come out into public and expose the secrets and the confidences that they were given, but their experience should be available to the public. I don't see anything wrong with that. People used to write their memoirs, which were always very sort of self-serving and
Yes.
self-exculpatory. Nowadays we are more proactive than that. We actually comment on the ideas of the moment. I don't honestly see any problem with that. In any case, the politicians are doing more to put senior public servants out in the public space.
Right.
While you're still public servants, you have to go up in front of parliamentary committees and are expected to answer for your decisions in the running of your departments. So they are completely complicit in exposing public servants more to public attention. And after we retire, it seems to me to be natural that we should therefore be doing the kind of advising on the issues. I think probably the line for me, and I'm sure for you, is not to get into the personalities
Right.
or the party politics, but to stay on the issues. And I think that if we stay on the issues, then we're entirely legitimate. I don't feel any inhibition from that, but I would never try and attack a politician directly. You can criticize their policies, and we all do in our books, and I would do so for either side if I disagreed with them. But I wouldn't take part in partisan political debate.
Very good. So Peter, thank you so much. It's been, as Gary said, an absolutely scintillating tour de force, actually,
You're very welcome.
overview, and lots of wisdom and insight, and we are all incredibly grateful. Thank you very much indeed.
No, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, thank you very much indeed. I have one last thing to do, which is to allocate my book. And I mean, one of my problems is I probably shouldn't give it to somebody who's already got it. So if somebody who's already said, thank you so much, I've read your book, probably, although I've had some fantastic questions, probably aren't the right answer. I wonder if the gentleman who asked me about the contention between arms sales and human rights.
Martin.
Martin, do you already have, can I offer you my book? For a very...
You know what, very kind, but I'd like the audio version.
Okay.
I wondered whether you might give this one to Steve.
Yeah, Stephen asked a very interesting question on Africa.
Yes. Well, I thought the question on strategic influence was very good, but you've read it. I'll give it to Stephen, and I will send you an audio book with great pleasure. Stephen, I will endorse it for you in a moment, but thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, everyone.